Nice crowd. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First, my beloved colleague points out that Japlish has struck. You will notice on your little blue flimsy that we are honored to have with us the mayor of Atlanta. I don't know if that was a put-up job or not. I'm not going to do a long intro because everyone knows this gentleman, and I think everyone feels kind thoughts toward him. Mr. Young was the very close associate of the Reverend Martin Luther King, U.S. Congressman in 1972, and now the mayor of one of our more interesting cities in the United States. And that's about all I have to say. Mr. Mayor?
I hope you'll forgive me as the mayor of Atlanta for beginning by saying one of the best things about being mayor of this city is that you have a business community that's willing to take its own time and its own money to go around the world and recruit competition. And in some real sense, that's what the Chamber of Commerce is doing by coming to Japan and China and Hong Kong on this trip, and last year to Scandinavia, in the spring to Ireland and Germany. They essentially are recruiting competition because we've learned, I think, that our particular brand of capitalism really is not a matter of dividing up the pie so much. If you can keep the pie growing, then everybody gets more. And the experience that we have enjoyed in the city of Atlanta is the experience of a business community that has an enormous sense of social and political as well as economic responsibility. And that's one of the reasons why things are going so well in that city and why it makes it very, very easy for me to serve as mayor. We've also been fortunate over the years to have governors that looked beyond the state, beyond the South, beyond indeed the borders of the nation. And former Governor George Busby spent 8 years of his term in office essentially building relationships with the business and politics of Japan, and we're very glad that he continues to work with us because that's what we see the Southeast all about. That's basically what we see as the business of the city of Atlanta. The business of the city of Atlanta is business, and that's one of the reasons why we're so attracted to the Japanese experience. But I'm basically a politician, not a businessman. And my concerns with Atlanta over the years have evolved out of the willingness of this city to come together to solve social problems. I think one of the reasons for our phenomenal growth over the past 20 years is that the business community in the early 1960s sat down with black leadership and begin to determine that they were going to work together to solve the problems of the entire region. They adopted as a motto, a city too busy to hate. And I think we've been a city busy growing and prospering ever since. And it's in that context that I determined that I was going to run for mayor of this city. I had just left the United Nations, and I guess from my earliest days as a member of the House Banking Committee, it disturbed me that my country's economy was running a trade deficit. Not just trade deficits to Japan and Germany, but we were running trade deficits to Nigeria and Mexico and Venezuela. That the business of trading was not something that we as a nation had had to focus on. We basically were a self-contained economy. We had all of the raw materials and natural resources that we needed, and so most American business devoted itself to the domestic market, and if anybody wanted to come and buy something from them, they were glad to sell it. But we really never had to develop an export-oriented economy. And I saw that particularly after the 1973 devaluation of the dollar and the hike in the oil price, I saw that as one of the critical issues of our nation. And coming back to the city of Atlanta, a city with 475 of the Fortune 500 companies, a city with major corporations like Coca-Cola, with the second largest concentration of IBM employees, a city that is developing as a high technology center, a city with the world's busiest airport, with some 2,000 flights going and coming every day, a city that holds the record in air travel for 2,239 flights in a single day, a city that's roughly half black and half white, a city that has a significant Hispanic population and a rapidly growing Asian population, a city that really does not only represent the diversity of the American experience, but a city that has learned how to bring people together and essentially maximize that experience. That it seemed to me that if American business was going to learn to export from anywhere, it was going to be from a city like Atlanta. And so I ran for mayor thinking that this is going to be the next great city, the city of the 21st century. And I still believe that. And I think that's the direction in which we're moving. And for us, Japanese business and industry becomes a very important part of that. There was a time when America could go around the world, and when the combination of American military power and American monetary power plus American political vision, we could pretty much get our way and almost do anything we wanted to do. Our military power is not limited. Our political vision, however, in the last few years, as a good Democrat, I think has been limited. We have begun to focus in and become more and more nationalistic at a time when the world demanded visionary leadership that gave some global sense of direction to the economies of the world. And we've not been able to offer that. But I see in our neighbor and ally, the nation of Japan, I see in Japanese business a sense of how to go around the world, a nation that is set up indeed almost as a nation, as a gigantic trading company. I see you here in this nation as really a natural ally in the process of moving ahead to bring about some global order and stability and raison d'etre for the economy that we all share. And I don't know that we have any excuse for not doing that. We have the resources, we have the technology, far beyond any generation of people on this planet before now, and we just have not really put together the sense of political camaraderie and the politics of doing the things out on this small planet of ours that everybody knows we need to do. I've been terribly attracted to a notion that has come from the Mitsubishi Research Institute, a notion of a global infrastructure fund. This naturally would appeal to people from Georgia, because what you're talking about really, or what Mitsubishi is talking about, is a kind of a global New Deal. And we in Georgia know that our growth and development goes back to the Tennessee Valley Authority. We have more man-made lakes than any other state in the Union. All of those were products of a gigantic infrastructure scheme that gave us a state that right now is ready to become a world leader, because all of that foundation was laid 40, 50 years ago. And I know what can be done on a global basis if the technology, if the finances, if the political will of the planet were directed toward those kinds of global infrastructure needs. The Mitsubishi Research Institute has talked in terms of a macro engineering scheme that might assemble over a period of time some $500 billion, that might take on projects like a sea-level Panama Canal, that might begin to see the value of a tunnel under the Mediterranean or under the English Channel, or transcontinental highways across Africa. Basically, that kind of thinking coming from Japan is exactly what I think the world needs. But Japan can't do it alone. And it's the feeling that the technical and the economic vision, actually the excess capital is here also. And while we welcome all that you want to invest in Georgia and the Southeast, the truth of it is we will all be better off if we find some ways to avoid the kind of growing cutthroat competition that exists as we simply trade and intersect with each other's economies. If it's just going to be Europe and Japan and the USA fighting back and forth for the same market, that's not going to last very long without us coming to some serious difficulties. But we've got an entire planet out there that needs everything we can produce and that can solve some of the problems of the world essentially through the technology, the capital formation, and the transformation of some of the needy regions of the world as a result of our marshaling our resources. I think of what might happen with the sea-level Panama Canal. Every bit of truck-producing capacity in Europe and Japan and the USA would be required to provide enough trucks to haul the dirt out of a Panama Canal, but also a lot of people who are fighting each other. In Nicaragua and El Salvador, if there were good-paying jobs right down the isthmus a little bit, you never can tell what would happen in terms of absorbing a lot of the hostilities by economic opportunity that might be generated on a global basis. And I think it's because we in America tend to look to Japan for that kind of world vision and leadership as a true and genuine partner with us that the remarks of Prime Minister Nakasone really, fell like a ton of bricks. And yet we understood. And we understood, for we have been through this kind of turmoil before. In fact, we're still in it. It's taken us 20 years to learn to talk to each other black and white, and we still finally make some mistakes. We're just learning to talk to each other male and female. Not long ago, I said to my daughter and my wife that one of the girls at the office said such and such to me. She said, "Daddy, you don't have any girls at your office. As long as you fought to stop people from calling you boy, you ought never refer to the young women in your office as girls." Well, that's an ongoing struggle that we're in the middle of, and evidently you are too. The whole world is going to have to learn together, male and female, black, brown, white, yellow, red, and we're going to have to learn to be sensitive to one another's cultures, and we're going to have to understand that we are going to make mistakes. And I think much of the black and brown leadership of the United States was willing to accept that as a natural mistake and move on, except that there was a kind of Pandora's box of undercurrent that we were not quite sure about. And so a lot of people who had little petty grievances over the years, grievances unlike those that Japan normally has to deal with within the United States. For instance, 250 black automobile dealers. The black economy is valued at approximately $190 billion annually. Black income is about the size of the total earning power of Canada. And yet, of the 250 black automobile franchises around the country, not a single one is able to sell a Japanese automobile directly a new car. And so when Prime Minister Nakasone's statement came, all of a sudden the automobile dealers started calling each other. The black periodicals, Ebony, Jet, Black Enterprise, and a whole string of them, the daily newspapers, had complaints that they don't get advertisement from Japanese corporations. And so one of the reasons why you get a lot of press on this is that there are people who have a vested interest in stirring it up. The other thing was a terrible uneasiness about where Japan might be in relationship to South Africa. We noticed that Prime Minister Botha was here. We have successfully, I think, convinced our Congress that perhaps the only way to avoid bloodshed in Southern Africa is to begin to apply certain kinds of sanctions that will create an incentive within the South African business community to begin to pressure the South African military to accept the possibilities of change. We lived through that. We could not have changed the South without sanctions from the Supreme Court, without the threat of the government, the federal government, withdrawing its funds. In fact, when the truth is told, Atlanta became a city too busy to hate, largely because, as a result of the confrontation over school desegregation in Little Rock, a lot of business moved out of Arkansas. And so we are very much aware of the sensitivity of business to social and political trends. And we're very much aware that while it might take 50% of a power shift to change political power, it only takes a change of 10 or 15% to take a profitable enterprise and make it unprofitable. No economy, whether it's racist or militant or whatever it is, can continue if it's not profitable. And if it's not profitable, that economy will change, even the die-hard South African economy. But the black community was not sure, and there was no reason for us to believe that Japan understood those kinds of dynamics of social change. And so there were people who wanted reassurances that Japan would not move its business in as we finally began to get American business out. Well, really what we're calling for and what I think people are looking toward is the possibilities of a new understanding, because we see that we are partners in the economy, and there's nothing we can do about it. I have a 13-year-old son. Normally he fusses when I go away somewhere. When he found out I was going to Japan, it didn't take him 10 seconds to say, bring me back one of those little Casio data bank watches and a T-shirt from the Hard Rock Cafe. Our children are a part of one global economy, and that economy is based on their needs, their desires, their expectations and aspirations, and they really are not nearly as nationalistic as any of our politicians are. And so we are a part of a global economy, and we are going to have to solve the problems of this small planet together. And I think what we see, both in this trade mission, both in the kind of dialogue that I think is going to come about as a result of the Prime Minister's remark, is that I can see us indeed growing closer together. We might realize that this was a kind of opportunity for us. There are people that are working very quietly, both in the United States and here in Japan, working to build bridges. My friend here, Mr. Tajiri, a citizen of Tokyo but also a citizen of Atlanta, who has been over the last 20 years trying to help us in Atlanta to work together. He talked to me about an Afro-American Japanese Chamber of Commerce as far back as 1980. And he'd been talking with others before then. The kind of thing that Mitsubishi is talking about is also being talked about by engineers at Georgia Tech and at MIT. It's also the discussion of European engineers, particularly those in Scandinavia. And so what we're seeing is the world approaching just the kind of dilemma that makes us reach out for new opportunities. And I think what we see in this experience, and what I will take back to Atlanta from my visit here in Tokyo with this business delegation from our city, is I can take back with me a real feeling that as a result of the recent events, there will be a greater understanding as well as a greater sensitivity between the United States and Japan, particularly between Japan and the minority population of the United States. And as a result of that, and as a result of some of our discussions with the macro engineers of both countries, and particularly when you hook that up with the kind of haggling that's going on with the International Monetary Fund, where they're fighting over a diminishing pie, somebody's going to say pretty soon, as we said after the Second World War, there's no need in us going into a global depression. We've got the resources working together to take on the problems of this planet. We did it with the Marshall Plan. We in the South will say, yes, we did it for the United States in the New Deal. And in doing those kinds of things, I think we set forth the hopes of humankind. We began to take up some of the money that now puts over $1 trillion of the world's economic growth into weapons of defense. And we began to challenge friend and foe alike to be a part of the peaceful development of the planet. I would hope that as a result of trade missions like this, as a result of the kind of debate and dialogue that we will enjoy this afternoon and that we have enjoyed on this trip and will continue to enjoy in China and Hong Kong, I hope that we're building bridges that really will make this a much friendlier planet, a much more productive planet. We welcome Japan Airlines flying daily into Atlanta, and we're glad that they'll be joined in the beginning of the year by Delta Airlines. And our experience is that whenever that kind of air link occurs, not only does business increase, but cultural exchange increases and an awareness of one another continues. I'm also grateful, since I've been waking up at 2 and 3 o'clock every morning, for cable network news, which is also based in Atlanta, and which is helping to almost do a kind of video colonization of the planet. But regardless of what you think about what's going on here, there's a heck of a lot going on between the United States and Southeast. There's a lot going on between the United States, between Japan and Atlanta. And most of it is very, very good for all concerned. And as we have our little ups and downs, let's never take our eyes off the big prize, which is all of us living together as brothers and sisters on this planet in peace and in prosperity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary Young. We will take questions now. Please, working press only. Come to the microphone and identify yourself, please. Brad Martin.
Brad Martin from Newsweek. What's the experience of people in the Atlanta area working for Japanese companies?
I think our experience has been very good working for Japanese companies. I was down in Hamamatsu meeting with Yamaha that's going in just south of Atlanta, somewhere between Peachtree City and Noonan, Georgia. And they are looking forward to working in that environment, and the people there are looking forward to working with them. And when we do business in Atlanta and in Georgia, and when people are hired, when subcontracts are let, it's really done black and white together. In fact, one of the businessmen we have with us on this trip is Mr. Tom Cordy, a mechanical engineering contractor that's doing a joint venture with Hitachi, building 120 subway cars for the system of Atlanta. Tom, you want to raise your hand? And I would say that kind of partnership in a $120 million project is very good for everybody, and everybody looks forward to that kind of involvement with the Japanese business coming into our region.
No questions? What is this?
Tom Ashbrook with the Boston Globe. Mary Young, you talked to the Prime Minister Nakasone. We've seen reports of that in the papers here. It's been noted by some that he apologized for his recent remarks, but didn't exactly retract them. Did he explain them any further to you, or what's your understanding of them now?
Well, my discussion with him was that really no explanation was necessary. That the kind of sophisticated debate that has been going on within the United States, I mean, it took us 10 years to figure out the difference between, black and colored and Negro. And we've learned that in any kind of multi-ethnic process, we're going to need to be understanding and forgiving if we're going to grow together. And so really we got on with other things, and I did not, and I was not interested in rehashing what he said or didn't say. I was really trying to respond to what I thought were some of the real problems that made the comments so explosive. Almost any other head of state could have made a comment like that and it wouldn't have been news at all. It was for Japan because we do think of ourselves so closely intertwined with Japan in so many ways. We also have a way of thinking of, this business that anything the Japanese do technically is perfect. I was so tickled to death when one of the TV cameras that interviewed me broke down. It really made me feel good that they make mistakes and their machinery doesn't work perfectly all the time too. We've sort of bought this Japanese mythology that everything that the Japanese do goes without a hitch. But we have to realize that living and working together, we are going to make mistakes. And the sooner we get over those mistakes and get about the business of living and working together, the better off we're going to be.
I'm Sue Scully of the Mainichi Daily News. Earlier you mentioned, I guess, the fact that the black media are not getting any advertising from Japanese companies and something else in that matter. You dismissed those as being, what was the word you used? Vested interests in stirring things up. That sounds to me a little bit like you're glossing things over. Could I have your comment on that?
No,
Are those real problems?
I wasn't glossing things over. I think those are the real problems. But those are the things that I think we will be finding ways to deal with. And what I think is going to occur out of this is, for instance, it's already going on. This weekend happens to be the weekend of the Congressional Black Caucus in Washington. So you probably have somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 black leaders from all over the country. Well, the Japanese Consul General is there. And there's been an active discussion with those black leaders of this kind of problem. The United Nations is also in session, so that a number of African leaders will probably be meeting with black American leaders. That's the significant issue. But I think that what we're now able to do is we're able to focus on some of those problems, and they should not be very hard to resolve. After all, Japan's problems with the United States, for the most part, has been trying to limit its exports. This is a constituency that wants to sell more Japanese cars. That wants to be more involved economically with Japan. So there's no conflict of interest there. So that's the reason I glossed over it, because I think it's a problem that can be solved and everybody can benefit.
Dr. Khan.
Omar Khan, Al Jazeera Arab News. Mr. Mayor, I have two questions, small ones. The first one is, as Mr. Andrew Young, a black politician, leader, and a gentleman, what do you think of this myth, or is it a reality that there is something of a difference between, the mental capabilities in the blacks and whites and yellows and greens and browns? This is one thing. What do you think? And second question is, as you suggested, that there was this reference of Afro-American Japanese bank. There is Afro-American Arab bank. Yeah. Don't you think that this new thing can be added, then something could be done so that it's more global?
Well, actually, it was some of the discussions of Mitsubishi Research Institute proceeded initially with the Arab development banks. And about 4 years ago, one of our projects out of Atlanta was to bring together people from three of the Arab development banks, plus the World Bank and the OPEC fund in Tunisia to meet with representatives of African countries to talk about joint financing and development of development projects, so that any kind of dialogue that emerges on this is going to be, it's going to have to involve the entire world. And the Arab banks are going to have to be involved. They're right now a little short of capital as the oil prices decline, but it's highly unlikely that the price of oil will stay this low for too much longer. And we're going to probably end up with a world with a little more financial equilibrium. But everybody's going to have to be a part of this. This is not something that the United States and Japan can do alone. It's not something that the United States and Europe, or the United States, Europe, and Japan can do alone. It's going to require involvement in decision-making and putting together some of the projects with the business and political leadership in those countries where the projects might take place. About the first question, it depends on whose test you're giving. And I think that's one of the problems. Japanese youngsters take Japanese tests. Black American youngsters take tests that essentially prepared by a white middle-class testing service. And even so, in the city of Atlanta, our children in our public schools that are predominantly black and that are predominantly poor in the public schools are achieving at national averages, and 65% of our public school young people in Atlanta go on to university. That's as good a percentage, I think, as Europe and Japan. And we are taking, and this includes people who have come into Atlanta from rural areas. In one of our public schools, we have children that start out in 23 different languages and are having to learn in English with a little support system in their native language. And the problems of testing and of intelligence, I think, are not so much native intelligence as they are the cultural norms which determine it. But let me say, too, that everybody has a certain kind of ethnocentrism. I was down at Camp Zama, the military base, and there was a wonderful gospel singer. And he was, from somewhere down south, and he was singing good gospel music. And I looked over because I heard a piano that was really getting down. And I looked over there and I saw a little Japanese lady behind the piano. And so I asked the fellow sitting next to me who was black, "She's got to be Japanese American, huh?" And he said, "No, she's Japanese. Well, my prejudice is nobody's supposed to play blues like that unless they grew up in Georgia. We all have those kinds of, little chauvinist sentiments about each other. And I think that the only way we've been able to get along in Atlanta is that we've learned not to take these so seriously. And we've learned to joke about them with each other and, and not get all upset.
Dan.
Dan Snyder, the Christian Science Monitor. Mayor, there's been some suggestions or criticisms of the Japanese in recent time that there hasn't been sufficient recycling of the Japanese current account surplus into the developing world, that in contrast to maybe what you were saying about the Japanese leadership on some of these issues, or leadership of some Japanese on these issues, that in fact there hasn't been much Japanese investment into the developing sector in comparison to where the money is going into the United States or into Western Europe. Do you endorse those criticisms, or how do you feel about that issue?
Well, I would say it probably is a fact But nobody invests when there's no stability and order to get a return on one's investment. And one of the reasons why I think Japan can't do it alone is that the kind of long-term investments that are required to be productive and profitable in the third world are going to require a kind of global commitment to security and stability in those areas and some kind of multinational guarantee. Those are things that can be negotiated. And I think that it's something we need to do. It's not easy, but that's the reason why investment has trailed off in the developing world. But one of the things that if you set out to raise the per capita income of the developing world to $1,000 a year, just that fact would create approximately $3 trillion market. The third world really is a better trading partner to the United States than Japan or Europe. And the potential is there and the wealth is there. But we've got to get beyond some of the little intramural skirmishes. And I don't think they're that hard to get around. I think you could settle Nicaragua. Nicaragua, after all, is 3 million people. There's nothing they can do one way or the other to hurt the United States. But if you keep fooling around with Nicaragua and neglect Mexico, you'll really be in trouble. But whenever we begin to focus on some of the problems of the planet from economic perspective, we will begin to develop economic solutions. And I think those economic solutions will have to involve the enormous experience of the Japanese Trading Company. But hopefully, the Japanese Trading Company would go with some of its American and European partners that would also be black, white, and brown.
Mayor Young, if I may ask a question. You came out of the Carter cabinet as ambassador to the UN. You're a close friend of President Carter. You're leaving here this afternoon in order to be back for the opening of the Carter Library tomorrow. And you've now been through 6 years, or you've watched 6 years of the Reagan administration. And President Reagan has been called the Teflon president. From Lebanon through the economy, through anything that seems to go wrong, no one lays a glove on him. And of course, with President Carter, anything that went wrong, he was pretty well knocked down for. What do you reflect on this?
Well, I think that President Reagan had about 40 years of experience in dealing with mass media. He plays you all like a drum. And if there's nobody that's so nearly, he is a master manipulator of the press. And Jimmy Carter was much too honest for that. He took every question you asked seriously and tried to give you a serious answer, and you can't deal with you all that way.
Please come up.
Susan Shearer from the New York Times. I actually want to follow that up in a more serious vein. Not to sound defensive, I've never covered the president. Luckily, I've been here. But my impression as a member of the press is that even when the press covers the president, tries to pin him down on mistakes or tries to, as certainly my paper and others have tried to recount in countless stories about what's been happening in the economy, what's been happening about redistribution of wealth, etc., that somehow that doesn't make any difference either. And I'm just curious about your comment on that.
Well, I think that again, as a master of the media, he really, in fact, there was a very interesting parallel between President Reagan and Franklin Roosevelt, one that I found fascinating because it's an ability to stick to the big picture and not get bogged down in the details. And I think Jimmy Carter, as an engineer, I mean, an engineer's disease is to get bogged down into the details. And you get detailed, analysis of every little link in the bridge, and where the bridge is going gets lost in the story. And I think that on one hand, you'd say, is it better to have a president that has a sense of direction and no sense of detail, or a president that has a real sense of detail? And I think President Carter had a sense of direction, but I really have agonized over this man because I like him and I respect him. And Dr. King used to say that greatness is characterized by antitheses strongly marked. You've got to have a tough mind and a tender heart. I think Jimmy Carter had both, but he could never quite get them together. I mean, he couldn't reconcile the two in a way that it made sense to the American people. So that was very helpful in a campaign. Everybody that wanted to see a hard-nosed conservative saw it. See? And everybody that wanted to see a man of vision and compassion saw it, because he's both. But on any given decision, once you get in office, you're required to reconcile those two in a coherent sense of direction. And that's very difficult to do in most issues. I talked with the chairman of one of the ranking members of the Ways and Means Committee before Rostkowski took over, and he said that they went over to talk to President Carter one time about the tax bill, and said the tax code was a document that was fully 10 inches thick. And when they went over to talk with President Carter about it, they all got intimidated, because he had read the damn thing. And they had been in the Congress passing those laws, but none of them had ever sat down to read it. And so he really intimidated a lot of people. But that happens in the presidency. I used to see congressmen get intimidated by President Ford, who were his running buddies they were his good buddies in the gym and everywhere else while he was in the House. Once he became president, they couldn't talk to him anymore. And when you get a president who's really bright, and Jimmy Carter is really bright and maybe too disciplined for his own good, that intimidates a lot of his advisors. It meant that some of the broad brush ways of dealing with issues didn't really come out. There were also very few of us that had any experience in Washington. Washington is I really think one of the great losses of the Carter administration was the loss of Burt Lance. Because, see, all of us were poor. We didn't know how to invite folk to dinner. We'd invite you home to cook, but we didn't know how to set up a Washington dinner. Burt Lance knew how to do that. And he knew how to get the right folk together, and he had enough folk to pay for a decent meal. But Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell didn't know how to do that, or Stu Eisenstadt, or Jack Watson, all great guys, very bright. But all of us were intimidated by Washington social life, and Washington social life really is a political power factor that any administration has to deal with.
Please.
Brian Jenkins with Cable News International. I have two questions for you. Mr. Mayor, one political, one economic, but both very serious to the members of the media. First of all, I'd like to ask one at a time. Are you satisfied that the intent of Prime Minister Nakasone's remarks, at the risk of belaboring this issue, was merely chauvinistic and not racist in character?
Yeah, I am satisfied that, in fact, I'd even go a little further than that. The debate has been going on in our own country, and we have a way of almost an excruciating self-analysis. We've been pouring out our souls over television about our literacy rate. And we really think that every single American ought to be able to read and write, and we're committed to seeing to it that that happens. And when we test our children, we test everybody, rich and poor alike. And so our statistics really reflect pretty much an accurate appraisal of what's done. Well, when it comes out in the press, it looks a lot worse than it is. And I think that Prime Minister Nakasone had probably been involved in reading about that ABC television special. I think that he had made his remarks before the Educational Testing Service report came out. But the debate on literacy, in fact, President and Mrs. Reagan have been involved in literacy campaigns for the last couple of months. So that whole question is one that I'm sure he found fascinating and was maybe, I would say, saying matter-of-factly, I'm glad Japan doesn't have that kind of problem.
My second question, an economic one. As you pointed out, over the past few years, Atlanta trade delegations have been to a few places and spent time in a few places for a few days. What tangible or intangible results do you derive from these kinds of trips or from having a Georgia trade office in Japan?
Well, I think the Georgia trade office in Japan, the commitment of governors from Governor Busby, Governor Joe Frank Harris presently, all the way back to Jimmy Carter and Carl Sanders, the trade offices in Japan and in Europe have left us with 160 Japanese companies in Georgia, second only to California in number of Japanese companies, and over 1,000 foreign companies that are based now in doing business in Georgia that employ almost 70,000 Georgians. And so it really does pay off. The Swedish banks that we visited 2 years ago and one major Swedish contractor came in to talk with me about investing in developing downtown housing. I think Governor Busby started with the Yamaha plant almost, in 1977. So that it's a long process, and most of what we're doing now will probably not bear fruit for another few years. Though our experience has been that once the airline connection is made, that there's almost a quantum leap in the amount of business. And with Japan Airlines and Delta flying back and forth, we're looking forward to more immediate results from this trip.
Jimmy?
Jim Treese of Business Week magazine. You mentioned just now 70,000 employees of Japanese companies in Georgia. Japanese companies in the U.S. and indeed in Southeast Asia have a very poor record on promoting locals to positions of any real administrative authority. In fact, some Japanese trading companies, others are being sued in U.S. courts at the moment for sex and race discrimination. Apparently, it seems that only native-born Japanese speakers are allowed to become managers. I would like to know whether you have any evidence in Georgia that the Japanese companies are actually moving beyond what has been a poor record or improving upon that. And a second question, a more political one, in the coming election, as always in off-year elections and regular congressional elections, trade seems to be an issue. The Democrats seem to be making the case that the Reagan administration has been soft on trade. Do you see, even though you see that Nakasone's remarks may create a situation where we can begin to deal with some of the problems, do you think that dealing with the problems will take place early enough to defuse this as a political campaign issue, or is this a wonderful gift to black Democrat candidates on a silver platter?
Well, we don't have enough black Democrat candidates, and I think those that are moving along right now are basically doing so on domestic issues. The trade issues haven't, the trade issues essentially have hit specific regions. The automobile region, the textile region, the steel mills. And in those specific regions, I think that particularly right now, the farm regions are hardest hit. I think, frankly, the farm regions are being hurt more by drought and accumulated interest rates than simply by trade. But, you can, it's always easy to pick on somebody that's not around. And so some of that happens during any election. The first question I forgot.
The employment.
Oh, the employment question. Up to now, I have not had any complaints in Georgia about employment and promotions. It's probably inevitable that at some point, we'll have to deal with those kinds of problems. But I think that's one of the reasons for an ongoing dialogue. And it's one of the reasons why visits like this and personal contact with the Japanese companies. And we've visited not only Japanese companies that we want to come to Georgia, but we've visited some that are already there, maintaining a kind of personal relationship. And there's no such thing as business without problems. But that's what you get paid for. And when those problems arise, we'll find a way to deal with those together.
Mr. Mayor, you've been strikingly conciliatory and maybe forgiving in your comments on the racial issue today. Do you feel at all constrained by your need to hold and attract Japanese investment in Georgia in your assessment of Japanese racial attitudes?
Well, let me say that I feel more constrained by my own experience as a disciple of Martin Luther King, and my own experience that you don't get anywhere solving problems jumping up and down screaming. That basically, if you've got a problem, you have to sit down. In fact, the nonviolent discipline is to start out with the assumption that nobody is to blame, that we are caught both in a situation that is in some sense unjust. But it's not the person to be blamed, it's the situation that we both need to come together and resolve. So that we can go on living together and working together as brothers. And that's basically the way I have been trained, almost from childhood to solve problems. But particularly that was the modus operandi of the entire black community during the 60s. And the cities where we worked that way, like Atlanta. For instance, there's an ongoing dialogue that's been going on in Atlanta with the business community and the black community since 1960. And once a month, 20 black leaders and 20 white leaders who are chief executive officers of their corporations and institutions meet for a couple hours and talk about problems that are going on from day to day, but more anticipating problems that might occur in the future and deciding how they're going to deal with them together. And this is at the highest level of business in the city of Atlanta, and it doesn't usually include the politicians, though whenever there's a political issue that we have to deal with, we get invited. But that kind of conciliatory approach to social problems is really a Southern tradition, an Atlanta tradition, and more especially, I think, a black tradition. It's also a Christian tradition.
Marianne?
Marianne Masker, ABC News. Mr. Mayor, you were talking about South Africa. What is your opinion on the prospect of a black American ambassador to South Africa? Does that put the ambassador into an untenable position, or is there some benefit that can be gained from that?
Well, I think that it depends on the ambassador. I really was an advocate of Bob Brown as ambassador because Bob Brown had worked in the Nixon administration as a Republican in the White House, got along with the Nixon folk and got along with the civil rights movement, He'd been a consultant for the tobacco industry and for the 10-cent stores, Walgreens, Woolworth, while he was serving on the board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He's a good friend of Jesse Jackson and a good friend of Jesse Helms. And I figured that's the kind of guy you need to send to South Africa. But I think the average, State Department diplomat who has not been a part of the social struggle of desegregating the South is going to be put, he's got a lot to learn. Now, most of the ambassadors that I have met in the State Department, whether they be black or white, are very well trained, very well disciplined, and a black ambassador will certainly do no worse than a white ambassador would do. Any ambassador in South Africa is going to have a hard time through this period. The advantages of a black ambassador, and there have been black foreign service officers in South Africa continuously for the last 20 years that I know about, well, at least 10. And they have been very well received by both blacks and whites. There is in South Africa a white minority that knows that South Africa is going to have to one day live and work together, black and brown and white together, and that the black ambassadors or the black foreign service officers who have been serving in South Africa have tended to try to mobilize a multiracial experience even in the midst of the South African scene. And they've been doing it with some success. South Africa isn't all bad. It's bad. But last time I was there was about 78, and I really felt that it was about like the southern part of the United States was when I was growing up. It could change just as rapidly as we've changed in the South. And that, basically what it needs is a little pressure and a lot more leadership from the President of the United States and from Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. I think those two hold the key to moving South Africa. Prime Minister Thatcher really responded very well to Rhodesia and Zimbabwe. And without the leadership of Margaret Thatcher and Lord Carrington, the Carter administration alone could not have brought about the independence of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, interestingly enough, is now attracting white families back. There have been 5,000 white families that have gone back to Zimbabwe in the last 18 months, I understand. And the black and white problem in Zimbabwe has, that's been just about 5 years. They're doing very well together. South Africa could change just that quickly. But it does take some pressure, and it does take some leadership.
Dave Schweisberg, UPI. Mayor, it strikes me that when you say that there's nothing to be gained anymore from jumping up and down and that we should learn to live together and work with each other and the benefits are there, it strikes me that that's what Ronald Reagan's been saying about South Africa, which has been denied by most of the black leaders. Now, I think the problem with the Prime Minister's comments, from anyone who knows Japan, was that they were taken as a confirmation of a Japanese attitude towards other races. Not in especially blacks here, but certainly towards Koreans and some others.
And whites. I think that, that's what makes it wholesome. Everybody kind of figures I'm the best. I mean, and if you look at it as a kind of a universal chauvinism that anybody that really respects himself ought to have. And then we can kind of live with it.
Yes, sir, but there's more than chauvinism here. There's legalized discrimination against Koreans, for example. It's, of course, not as high a degree as in South Africa, but there are people who feel discriminated against here. Question is, how can you justify on a theoretical level the attitude that Japan is okay and that you can deal with them when you're saying the reverse to the president in South Africa?
Well, I can say it because in South Africa, it's 85% of the population that's being discriminated against, that cannot own property, that has no rights to an education, no right to vote. There's no other country on the face of the planet that totally denies such an overwhelming majority of its citizens any rights. So there's both a quantitative and qualitative difference there. We would probably have people who are denied rights economically in the United States that would probably be similar to there's no society that's perfect on this score. And I think that all I'm interested in is our constantly working on improving these problems. But you don't really do it until the people themselves make a fuss. We don't change our babies' diapers until they cry. And we love our children. And there's got to be some kind of protest. Or you forget about the problem existing. And I suspect that Japan will in time have its social protests. It'll probably be women before it's Koreans. But there are going to be problems, and the Japanese themselves are causing the problems by creating television sets. Mass culture is a U.S.-Japan invention, it's the mass culture that technology has created that I think is the most powerful force for social change in the world today. I would gladly, if President Carter were president, not that the only difference with them on this issue is President Carter lived in the South through the period of desegregation, and he knew that it required strong leadership. President Reagan lived in Beverly Hills and didn't even know there was a social revolution going on. But still, the President of the United States has got to do this. And, if he understood that and were willing to take the personal responsibility for it, to do with South Africa, say what Carter did with Sadat and Begin, I would be an advocate of abandoning sanctions. Sanctions are only a means of starting the dialogue. Once the dialogue starts in earnest, and all the Congress is saying is that South Africa can end sanctions anytime they will let Nelson Mandela out of jail and start talking with the people whom they consider who are political prisoners simply because they want the right to vote. And once they start that process of talking to their own citizens about governing, sanctions automatically come to an end. Now, I would gladly see those sanctions come to an end and them start the debate or dialogue. And I would love to see the President of the United States, whoever it is, putting the power of the United States on the side of reconciling people who are different.
Doctor?
Mr. Mayor, I would like to ask you a simple question. What do you think of the present status of late Dr. Martin Luther King's dream? Would there be a black president of America, say away from an black ambassador, or vice president of America?
Well, let me say, I think Dr. King's dream can be quantified maybe best in economic terms. When he wrote his book, Stride Toward Freedom, the earning power of black America was $16 billion annually. That's a 1955 statistic, I think. The earning power of black America in 1985 was $190 billion. The number of people that are going to college was just about 250,000. There were only about 250,000 black college students in college prior to 1960. There over 2 million now. I mean, it's the educational, the economic. There were no black elected officials in the South, and now, you know, there are more than 600 in the South alone, 6,000 nationwide. We have, you know, I'm the mayor of Atlanta, but there are 19 black mayors in Georgia. Places like Thomasville, Gainesville, places where, I mean, when I tried to run a voter registration drive in Thomasville, Georgia in 1955, 500 Klansmen came out. And now Thomasville has got a black mayor and their stadium named after William Andrews, black football player. I mean, the changes, you know, are just nothing short of miraculous. Even in the small towns of the South. In terms of a black president, that's not so much a matter of race as it is politics. That I think before you're going to have a black president, before you can have any kind of president, I think you almost have to be a governor or a senator. We've never had a mayor make it to the presidency. We've never had anybody come right out of a corporation. I mean, I like Lee Iacocca, but making automobiles is not running for politics. And I think, you know, you give orders in a corporation. You have to beg and plead for people's vote and support as a politician, and not many corporate leaders are able to humble themselves, humiliate themselves that much. You've got to have a base, and you've got to demonstrate the fact that you can deliver some votes. So it'll be, you know, if Tom Bradley had won the governor's race, and he lost it by really just 100 or so thousand votes 4 years ago, if he had won, I think he clearly would have been on anybody's ticket. If you can carry California, you can be on a ticket. And you, even if you're black, if you can carry Texas, Henry Cisneros can be Hispanic. If he can carry Texas, he can be on a ticket. Maybe even before a Joe Biden, who's only representing the number of electoral votes in Delaware. Although I like Joe Biden very much, but Texas, with, you know, is going to have more clout than Delaware. And so the political makeup of our system will probably determine, you know, who is president. Maybe more so than the color. Anybody that can get to be governor of a major state or senator, you know, of a major state has got a good shot at it.
Lucas-san.
Tak Oka, Christian Science Monitor. Did you discuss sanctions with during a trip to Japan, and what would you consider appropriate for leaving the United States aside for the moment? What is the appropriate attitude for an industrialized country to take towards South Africa and its problems?
Well, I did discuss the whole question of sanctions with Prime Minister Nakasone, and he reminded me of some of the positions that Japan has taken in regard to imports, in regard to trade, in regard to opposition to apartheid traditionally, and at the United Nations. I have managed to talk about that almost any time I get a chance with almost anybody. Because I think that one of the ways to bring about a change and minimize the bloodshed is some form of sanctions by all of the industrialized world. The sanction that I think will be most effective is an airline embargo. And the reason for that is that it doesn't hurt anybody except those who profit most by apartheid. An airline embargo wouldn't totally isolate South Africa. They're close enough to Botswana, to Lesotho, to Mozambique, to Zambia, so that they could still drive their cars to those other places and catch planes to go to Europe. But there are 2,000 seats every night that leave Johannesburg for Europe and America. And the only reason why apartheid is pleasurable is you can make a whole lot of money and then go someplace else to enjoy it. Once people had to begin to experience some of the inconveniences of apartheid, I think they would be willing to come together, and the whole purpose of sanctions is to mobilize the business community to take on the military. And I think that's what, right now, South Africa is a state that's being dominated by its military, and everybody else is just sitting back and letting them handle it. If the business community were forced to make decisions about apartheid, they would do as they already have. They would oppose apartheid. The other thing is that South Africans going into these African countries to fly out would realize that they're not doing so bad. All of the things that South Africans fear, whites in Zimbabwe were afraid of in 1977 when we started talking with them. And yet none of the things that whites feared in Zimbabwe happened. And Zimbabwe is probably doing better now than it was before independence. But in race relations, you somehow have to get people to live by their hopes rather than by their fears. And the best way to do that is to encourage leadership by the business community. Business has to have a lot of faith in humanity, in the process by which we live, because they're investing their money hoping to get it back in the future plus more. You almost have to be a kind of an optimist to be in business. Whereas all you have to do is be reactionary to be a military leader. And so what we're advocating really is a shift in leadership from the military leadership to the business leadership. And an airline sanction is one of the best ways, I think, to provoke that. Once it occurs, I think South Africa's changes will be, almost overnight. In Birmingham, we had 100 businessmen sit down and agree to totally desegregate the city, start hiring blacks. They said they would get people to open up the voting booths, the voting registration lines, that they would encourage the school board to desegregate the schools. When 100 businessmen agreed to it in Birmingham, even though all of the laws of the state of Alabama were against everything they agreed to, neither Bull Connor nor George Wallace nor anybody else, said a word. Once there was a coalition of 100 key leaders of the business community. And that's what we're hoping for in South Africa.
Jim has the last question, I believe.
Just very quickly, if you could give us your prospectus for Democratic and Black caucus candidates in the coming election. What's it look like?
Well, I don't think anybody knows. My guess would be that the person who emerges is not even being, not even running now. And it's a strange kind of logic, but which would take too long to explain. But I would say the Democratic Party would probably go best with a ticket that would maybe be Bill Bradley and Sam Nunn. Because I think the problems we have to face are economic, and Bradley's one of the senators that's probably been in the forefront of discussions about global economic matters. Sam Nunn is generally, considered as the foremost security and defense expert. The problem is neither one of them are very ambitious and aggressive. That they're not, they don't have the fire in the belly. But that may not be bad either. We've had a whole lot of ambitious folk that didn't really have much leading them beyond their ambition. it may be, the American people are ready for a new style of leadership. I'm just fascinated by the idea of a guy who comes from Princeton and is a Rhodes Scholar, and that starts out with a network of the National Basketball Association, everybody from Larry Bird in Boston to Magic Johnson in California campaigning for him. Well.
Thank you very much, man. By tradition, we offer our guests membership in our club. We hope you come by on a Friday night. We have a Japanese woman pianist who also gets down in the bucket. Thank you. Let us get out, please.